Got it here. So I've been living internationally for about 16 years. So I come back to the US every so often. But for the past 11-ish years, I've worked for an international non-government organization. And it works on issues like human rights, gender, humanitarian response, climate issues, globally, with a head office in Ireland. But we have different country programs and offices around the world. We partner with local civil society organizations in all the countries where we work. So with this organization, I've worked in Central America, for 6 years in Sierra Leone, and then for the past 3 years in Kenya. So yeah, it's 1:30 a.m. in the morning here. So pardon my delayed responses and the slowness of the brain, but I'll try my best. And I have a lot of coffee to keep me going. But really happy to be here.
Great. Well, thank you. I should say that we had for a different event for a French film festival we're doing. We had a filmmaker zoom in this way, talking to us from Berlin, and it was the middle of the night there too. So this is just what the world is like now.
Get used to it. So you have to be flexible.
Okay. Louis, did you want to just talk about the raffle?
We're just doing a raffle here for I'll give you one of these tickets and you can put your name on it, and then I'll put it in this bag and we'll shake it up, and then I'll pick one for a free book. And I'm also giving these flyers that has a QR code that has the Amazon link, and it has also like the prices for like hardcover, softcover, ebook, and audiobook. As well, on the bottom there's the link to the publishing press's website for this book, where there's also the description and other links as well of where to buy it.
And I'll apologize. We thought we had it all set to have books right here for sale right now. They are I thought they were just going through Michigan. They actually went to Tennessee, and now they're making their way here. So I will have the books in print, and anyone interested later on as well would want to buy them here. So that should be here in the next couple days, unfortunately. But we'll still be pushing some books sales here. Okay, take it away.
Alrighty. I guess we can kind of just jump right into it, but we were kind of curious if you could tell us a little bit about your inspiration for this book.
See who you are.
Oh, I'm Isabel. I introduced myself earlier. Hi, I guess I'll introduce myself to the room. I'm one of the co-presidents for the Unite English Club here on campus. This is Corey.
I'm Corey. I'm the other co-president of English Club.
So
Great, yeah, perfect. Well, thanks, Isabel and Corey and everyone there. So yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask a quick question. Is anyone in the room also a writer? Do people enjoy writing or taking a stab at writing? See some hands. I can't see the audience, but I'm assuming there's a few writers in there.
there's a
Yeah, so I think, especially in fiction and fantasy or science fiction, I think that there's kind of a what if that maybe picks at the mind. And for me, I was thinking before I wrote Deficient, trying to imagine a future world. What would the world look like if humans were to change fundamentally, right? And I was imagining a future where, like, say, we just lived in sort of a wonderful future where we were able to overcome some of the problems that are plaguing us to this day, right? The divides around racial lines, ethnic lines, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. The things that really get us into trouble today as humans. If we were actually able to evolve and overcome those issues and live with one another in harmony, what would that be like? But would it be sustained if humans were to change on a fundamental level? So if we were to acquire supernatural abilities, for instance, or if humans were to evolve and change, how would we respond? So I've always been a big fan of superpowery things. I've always loved the X-Men, and I wanted to imagine a world where actually all humans evolved to acquire supernatural abilities, and that there was sort of a hierarchy that was put into place in terms of which abilities you were classified into. And the question there was, how would humans respond to this? Would we live in harmony and peace, accept one another, and have a really, utopian existence? Or would we kind of do the things that we actually have done in the past to divide ourselves, form ourselves into castes, and utilize those and that hierarchy as a form of discrimination, or to justify discrimination amongst ourselves? So maybe my brain is a little bit cynical, but I opted for the latter. I imagined that humans might not be so advanced if we were to change and evolve, and that there actually would be differentiated treatment based on the type of ability you have, and also whether or not you had an ability. So the book is called Deficient, and it takes place from the perspective of a 15-year-old boy, Alejandro Aragon, who's the only person in his school and family who does not have an ability. And it's particularly difficult for him. There's a lot of stigma, a lot of discrimination, feeling different and like an outsider, but in a really awful way. You know, people don't even want to engage with or even brush against someone who is classified as deficiently accelerated for fear that that might somehow contaminate their genetic makeup. So I think it also speaks to the experience of feeling different. You know, I grew up as queer in the, you know, kind of the homophobic 90s. It was not fun. But I think that sense of feeling different and not necessarily accepted in certain spaces that should have been safe also inspired a bit around the voice and perspective. But I think really anyone reading the book can relate to Alejandro's experience if you felt like an outsider before. So hopefully that explains that a little bit.
Great, thanks. Just got some people coming in here.
Welcome, I can see you all.
So you mentioned you do work for an NGO that works with issues of discrimination and poverty. So I was wondering how your novel and your writing and your work with the NGO intersect.
Yeah, so actually, when I first started drafting Deficient, I drafted Deficient in 2011, 2012, when I was living in Honduras. And at that time, I was actually working for a different organization. It's a grassroots organization called the Organization for Youth Empowerment, or Oye Adelante Jóvenes in Honduras. And that organization was working with youth who were, I guess, classified as at risk. So at risk of getting involved in gang violence, at risk of just societal violence, at risk of not completing their education, and also at risk of structural issues like poverty or being forced to emigrate to search for better opportunities, right? A really fantastic organization that had an interesting model of supporting education access to young people who might not be able to access, though it was merit-based, based off of their previous education. That was support for families, for instance, that would have struggled to send their sons or their daughters to high school, for instance. Then there were also interesting programs around journalism, the arts, sports, radio, community outreach, and graphic design. And the programs have just grown. They've really blossomed over the years. So it was a combined program around, you know, community engagement plus interpersonal development and empowerment. So I think as I was writing Deficient, I was also living in a context where the city I was living in, El Progreso, was just, you know, in the shadow of San Pedro Sula, yeah? And at the time, San Pedro Sula was classified as the homicide capital of the world. Extremely dangerous in terms of levels of street crime, violence, narco trafficking, corruption in the area. So I found that, you know, young people were really facing a lot in Honduras. So even from my experience growing up in the US, growing up for anyone is challenging, right? Youth is challenging, adolescence is challenging. There's so much to get through and go through. But on top of that, I found that young people who were involved with the Organization for Youth Empowerment were grappling with some really serious life issues. And it just required a monumental amount of strength and resilience to get through. So I think that also kind of intersected with, you know, the character of Alejandro Aragon. Yeah, so I kind of wanted him to be one of the Oye youth in a sense, in the sense the 15-year-old main character, and to embody that experience of overcoming some really extraordinary circumstances. So I think that feeds into it as well. And I think sensing the differences, right? There was real stark differences in the society. So in El Progreso versus maybe where I grew up in New Jersey. So I was also trying to play with the idea of what would a future look like if there was a bit more control, if it was a bit more dystopian, if there was more government regulation, and how to create a society that was perhaps a bit more equal in the sense of how economic resources were distributed, and how wealth is distributed in a fairer way. Though there's ultimately at its core almost like this cancerous rot of the hierarchy around supernatural abilities, particularly if you don't have one. So I think, over the years, I moved on from that organization after about 3 years of work. I went to work with my current organization called Tropra in Central America, Sierra Leone, and Kenya. And as I've been revising the manuscript over more or less a decade, I think those experiences also fed into the diversity of the characters. The main character's best friend in the book, Yalamba, is really named after and designed after one of my best friends from Sierra Leone, who was pivotal to my time there. So I think it was the richness of the characters was also attributed to those experiences and the people I met in diverse contexts.
Great. It sounds like your overseas experience has played a lot into kind of like who you are, not only as a person, but also like what you've done as an author. So that's great to share. Thanks. On the topic of Yalamba and all of Ale's friends, we were kind of curious as to, out of all the diverse characters in your novel, maybe who your favorite was, or if you had one.
Yeah, great question. I think I sympathize with Alejandro based on his experience, right? And I think his voice sounds a lot like mine, even though he's his own person and it is a work of fiction. But I think, there's a special connection between, I think, myself and Alejandro, right? So I think that's a natural one. But I really enjoyed creating all the characters. I think they all almost wrote themselves. And I can see also some parallels, right? I kind of drew from also my own experience in high school. So certain characters like Gwen would have a strong parallel with someone I grew up with who was this really strong gymnast and really inspiring person in our high school. And then Yalamba, of course, because she's one of my best friends. And I think the personality traits, there's definitely differences, but the personality traits are very similar and made her easy to write. And then a character like Kazuki, who I just love, because I think the story is quite serious in the sense that it is a murder mystery, right? So Alejandro is the only deficient in his school. Yalamba is at the core of his life. She's his main advocate. She's the only one who really talks to him or stands up for him. And when she disappears, she's removed from the narrative. That rock in his life is also removed, right? That dependency, the person who gives him strength and meaning. And he needs to find it, but he also needs to find it without any sort of help. And I think he has to, channel his own inner resources and see how he can do that by himself without having a supernatural ability. So some of the supporting characters that emerge are really helpful in that journey. And I think understanding their individual differences and what makes them unique and what makes them drawn to someone like Alejandro, who is lacking in agency, not the most confident and struggling with self-esteem. A character like Kazuki, who is just kind of a bit of comic relief in this murder mystery, but also is just a really endearing character and critical for the resolution of the story. So I think that's another one who is kind of near and dear to me in terms of affection.
That makes sense. Kazuki's also my favorite character, so.
Everyone seems to like Kazuki, so I love that.
I appreciated the sort of paradoxical relationship between the great amount of diversity we see within the characters and cultures, but the, as you say, persistent rot of prejudice against people of different classifications and abilities. So I guess I'll ask, you mentioned you started drafting over 10 years ago. So where do you see the state of sort of queer and minority and just human rights in general? Where do you see the state of those now as opposed to when you began drafting the novel?
Yes, so much has evolved and changed in our world, right? And I think when I started writing, right, this was all before so much, right, around social media. This was, a few years after the economic crisis, a few years after the emergence of Twitter, and so a lot has changed. And I think even when I was in college, there were still issues, and this still happens, but there was more coverage on issues like homophobic discourse or attacks against gay students, suicides, and those types of things would have been kind of common to see, and unfortunately to see that. there wasn't as much visibility around issues perhaps relating to trans people and the particular challenges that they face. And I think the discourse is really around gender and gender identity has just blossomed in terms of how people identify. And I suppose, I mean, we have the issues around what's happening with J.K. Rowling. That was not happening, when I was drafting the book as well. I remember a book that I was really interested in at the time was the Hunger Games. I remember reading those around the time that I was drafting Deficient. But then if you look, I just recently reread all the Hunger Games books, and there's really very limited representation in terms of maybe, non-heterosexual characters, right? I imagine that there were actually, I remembered characters being queer that rereading it, they actually weren't. And I'm like, oh God, I just inserted that myself, right? And I think within writing in general, there's much more being published now from different diverse perspectives. And there's more openness, I think, among, publishers. And there's much more openness and acceptance around queerness and diversity at various levels. And explorations of different parts of, I suppose, the rainbow, right? And even on issues like asexuality, where in 2010, 2011, 2012, that wouldn't really have been a topic that was being explored. And now there are some really interesting books or perspectives or characters that have been designed from that lens. So I think, yeah, there's definitely an evolving discourse, but unfortunately, we still live in a world where people are treated differently. Lack of acceptance. I think our politics has not evolved at the way that it should, or our politicians or their thoughts. Though I remember, after I graduated college, there was still a hesitancy around even, gay marriage. That the very idea of that, don't ask, don't tell, was still in place. Yeah. And that affected people's decisions and career paths and relationships. So I think there's been a lot of change over the past 10 years, but there's a lot more change to come. And I think part of the writing journey is, authentically and in a way subtly capturing the diverse tapestry of who we are in our writing in an authentic way as much as we can.
Nice. So, I mean, obviously part of society today is still kind of trying to wrap their minds around like this whole idea of acceptance, especially people of different race, ethnicity, sexual identity, as you mentioned, which we do see some lack of acceptance in your book, but obviously it's in a different way. And we see those still like the consequences of this lack of acceptance. And so not a lot, but parts of your book are, I guess, could be classified as like trigger warning type instances. So was there anything that you found particularly difficult to write about? Something maybe that hit you a little too close to home, or you struggled with actually verbalizing?
Yeah, and I suppose I don't want to give too much away, but yeah, I mean, I think it's like one of the shows that I loved watching growing up was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I don't know if we have any Buffy fans in the room, but I found that to be an extraordinary example of exploring some of the themes of adolescence from a really unique lens through like monsters and demons, right? And it's a horror show, right? So people are going through these, grappling with these issues in high school, but done through demonology, right? And people are losing their lives, right? And it was almost, I remember the first episode of Buffy where I think one of the first deaths is that, there's a woman who opens the locker and then, a corpse falls through, and it's one of the students. So I wanted to do something similar where, there's a murder mystery happening in a high school setting, but at the same time, treating that in a way that's not so flippant was challenging. And then also seeing some of the characters who are exposed or who are going through that, being victimized or whatever is happening, and understanding their psychology and why they're doing the things that they're doing. And characters who are, on the verge of almost taking their own lives, and understanding the background. I think once you finish the book, you kind of see the fuller story of it. But I think that was a bit challenging around something that could be really triggering for specific readers. But understanding maybe the rationale behind people's actions or behaviors is also important in the broader scheme of things. And you don't really understand it until the very end. So I think trying to do that in a way that was made sense for the plot, but in a way that recognizing that actually some of this, a lot of the stuff is really serious. So it's not just the body falling out of the locker and then moving on with it. There's some really serious, dark stuff happening in the story. So I guess it's kind of why I needed someone like Kazuki to help lighten up the mood a little bit. But I found some of those scenes to be difficult to capture in the writing process. Yeah.
Speaking of the writing process, I know we've got some writers in here. What advice would you have for up and coming new writers?
Yeah, I think write as much as you can. Yeah, carry a notebook anywhere you can. Even if you just write a few words a day that inspire you, go for it. I think any experience that you have in life makes you a better writer. So it's every lived experience really that we have. And I would just encourage you to go for it, right? I think when I started writing, I took a creative writing course in college, and I remember being very intimidated by it. So the professor was actually Joyce Carol Oates, who's a very prolific writer. And I was in this class. A lot of the other students had gone to private schools and they had done creative writing before, and I felt completely out of my element. And I think the professor also made me feel out of my element because other people were much more advanced in terms of what I was bringing to the table. But I tried, I tried and tried and tried. And after I graduated, I held on to that passion, knowing it was a skill that I wanted to develop, like a muscle that I wanted to develop. It meant reading more books. It meant just writing more, journaling more. And it's an ongoing process. So Deficient was a challenging one. So it was not my first book that I've written, because I had written many other books before then. But none of them have seen the light of day. And I think everything that I worked on was a way of developing that muscle, even if it's not a published book. And I think for Deficient, I tried to apply as many of the lessons I had learned over that period of like the length of the novel that I was trying to write, trying to capture something that could be standalone in one book, which at the time publishers were really interested in kind of standalone stories, not just series. And yeah, trying to learn from that process. And I think I learned a lot from the process of editing the book over time. I think another thing is being very open with constructive criticism, not being afraid to get the work out and have other people look at it and not cringe when they're reading it. One of my most fantastic editors that I've worked with, actually, she just wrote to me and said, "Oh, Michael, I actually went to UNI for the first year before I moved out to the West, which I had no idea." And working with her and working with great editors later on in the process is also fundamental. And they'll steer you and they'll give you ideas, and it's worth taking them on board. It's worth also defending some things that you really want to keep and retain, right, as you're going through the editing process. Because if you're represented by an agent at some stage, or there's a publisher looking at your work, or there's an editor looking at your work, they're going to want to influence and shape it in certain ways. But I think ensuring that you retain the intention and the authenticity of what it is that you've created, but also being open to the feedback when there are certain technical things that you can improve. So yeah, and maybe an example from my own writing, like I think something that I learned even when in dialogue, right? Oftentimes in dialogue, when characters are talking to each other, you'll say things like, she exclaimed, or she yelled, or he shouted, or she... So using those diverse verbs can actually be distracting from the reader's perspective. So one of the pieces of feedback I got earlier on from the editor or the publisher was, actually minimize it. Less is more sometimes. So said is perfectly fine, even if you repeat it. Don't repeat the characters' names over and over again in dialogue, because that's not really how we talk. And another fun thing that I haven't done it in a while, but I used to do it, was if you're just listening to conversations, just actually trying to write down the conversations that you hear around you in terms of understanding how people actually communicate. To practice dialogue, I suppose, is something that's also interesting to do.
Very cool. I mean, I guess if you're talking about, you're giving all these examples of your own writing and how you've changed and grown over the years, is there maybe an excerpt from your book that you'd like to read or share with us?
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah. So I have the book here. This is Deficient, and I have a blurry screen, so sorry about that. So cool. Let me think of which one. I think I might actually read a passage from the second chapter. So if you've read the first chapter, if you've read Deficient, it starts off with Alejandro's shuttle bus ride to the school, and he encounters really terrible bullying on the way. And you just get a day in the life of Alejandro. He's literally counting down the hours that are left in his day, for the very first moment, because his day-to-day life is quite torturous. And when he gets to the school, he's bullied again by one of his worst bullies. And his best friend Yolamba kind of saves the day, right? So this is the passage where we are introduced to Yolamba's power and also to Yolamba as a character. So I might read this if that's helpful. Okay. A sudden boom of thunder draws my attention upward. A tsunami of charcoal clouds floods the sky, consuming the gray haze. I've never seen the transition happen so quickly. A giant scratch of white lightning cracks across the black clouds, and the thunder roars yet again. The rain that follows is an onslaught, like we're beneath a waterfall. Scheisse, Landon says. He tosses me to the side, and I plummet to the ground with a painful thud. I'm wet and cold. My face is pressed against the stone, and my lip is moist and tastes like copper. Splattering feet shuffle past me. No one stops to ask what's wrong or to help me up. It's not the first time I wish I could disappear like an unseen. Ale! I smile into the ground when I hear my nickname. It's not a name I hear often. In fact, there's only one person at the academy who uses it. I push myself onto my hands and knees to see Yolamba running toward me, her gray academy skirt swishing. In one hand, Yolamba is holding a glowing umbrella that emits a generous halo of white light. It evaporates the raindrops before they reach her head, keeping her dry. In her other hand, she has her sketchbook. Alejandro Aragon, Yolamba says as soon as she's at my side. She twitches her nose at me, a natural tick. Don't tell me you let that piece of scheisse knock you down again. What else was I supposed to do, Yals? Stand up for yourself. Fight back. Defend your rights. I can't help but laugh as she guides me to my feet. Sure, fight back against Landon. I wipe the grit from my face. Any other death wishes you want me to make while I'm at it? He's a dim-witted atlas. Your mind can dance circles around his. And he can crack my head open like a chicken egg whenever he wants. I prefer to keep my brain inside my skull, thank you very much. Shielding me from the rain with her glowing umbrella, Yolamba interlocks her plump arm with mine as we walk to the academy's entrance. In the light of the spotless lobby, I notice Yolamba's braids have changed to violet, matching the new color of her eyes. The day before, her hair had been a shocking pink, and her eyes their normal brown. The grin on her face is wide and mischievous. I can tell she's been up to something. You were the one who made that storm happen, weren't you? I ask. Yolamba winks a purple eye and opens her sketchbook. I see a drawing of Landon and me on the walkway. Rain pours from the sky, and a bolt of lightning flashes above our heads in the picture. It was a quick sketch, but it served its purpose. It's hard to suppress my smile as I think about Yolamba's ability to draw objects and scenarios into existence. She's the only feral at the academy with that kind of talent. To the other students, she's a freak, but to me, she's magical. So you get a bit of a sense there of how much, how important the character of Yolamba is to Alejandro. And you get a sense as well, there's different classifications. So the first page of the book is actually a list of the different abilities that you can have, and it shows that hierarchy. So the abilities that are quite common and more accepted are, the ones that we think about when we think about superpowers. So strength, speed, invisibility, telekinesis, telepathy, flight. So if you have those abilities, you're almost seen as normal, the cool crowd, you're accepted. You're a little bit different if you have 2 or more abilities. So if you're classified as a legion, you're almost seen as like too special or too extraordinary, and you're kind of like a lone wolf. And Yolamba's ability is called freely accelerated, or they're called ferals. So it could be people who have just a wild card ability that doesn't fit into the classifications, the more socially accepted ones. And often the abilities aren't so useful. They're like, people can grow their fingernails upon command, or change their skin color, or grow their hair. So they're not really necessarily respected like the other abilities. But there's some really powerful ones. And I think Yolamba is also exploring the power of her ability, where she can draw things into existence. And she typically draws things like cute, fuzzy animals. And I think others, look down on her for doing that. But there's also a power there, and she kind of is introduced by, drawing a storm into existence. And that almost invokes the power of, my favorite X-Man or woman, which is Storm. So Yolamba is able to actually capture and do quite a bit with her ability. And I think Alejandro relies on her for that, and she's a bit of a crutch in his life. So I think it sets up the story also for when Yolanda is removed and disappears, how much meaning and impact that has for someone like Alejandro.
Thanks. Well, thank you for sharing the excerpt. That was actually one of like the cooler parts, I think, of like Yolanda seeing her abilities and whatnot.
Yeah, thanks.
Shall we open up to audience
Do you guys
questions?
have any questions?
I guess I have one. I've been trying to write more diversity into my stories, but I'm always concerned that I'm going to get something wrong, or if I'm going to accidentally offend someone. And I know that's probably not going to happen, but I don't know. How do you do it?
That's a really good question. One of my friends in Ireland, actually, she's a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. And she read the book. And one of the things she said to me was she really enjoyed the subtle approach to it, because I think we've all seen and read things where it feels like sometimes the stories or the movies or the shows are ticking a lot of boxes, right? Because they want to appeal to the diverse audience. So in one way, it's good, but sometimes it might feel a bit forced, or it might also feel like in the hope to not leave anyone out, it somehow doesn't feel real or authentic. So it's this fine line of wanting to be inclusive of as many people as we can, this fear of leaving people out if we don't represent them, and kind of this sort of sadness as a creator of like you just always feel like a failure in that sense. But I kind of go back to my, my own early days and my early writing, right, and my own upbringing. So I come from a mixed ethnicity, mixed race household, even, perhaps if I don't, appear like it. But my father is Mexican American. My mother is a white woman from New Jersey. And my brothers and I are blends, from these two backgrounds. And it's really fascinating because growing up, I think we had a bit of confusion about that, about who we were and, where our father was from, or why he was different, or why he spoke Spanish. And I think what we read and what we watched, everything was kind of whitewashed, right? So even my own favorite show, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the entire cast of characters, the primary cast of characters were all white. And I don't think I viewed that as problematic until many years after, the final season of Buffy. I think it took, probably when I was in college, when I actually had a moment where I said, that was strange. How come I never thought to even question that? And my own writing, I was writing from perspectives of white characters, purely white characters, and not even from the perspective of my own background, right? And bringing invisibility to that. So I think, it forced me to examine that further. And I think also from my journey around acceptance of my queerness, acceptance of ourselves, I think that was also something I was afraid to tap into. But until I was able to tap into that in my own life, I was able to allow that piece to blossom within my own writing. And I think drawing from my experiences, right? So I think that was the other thing that, I grew up with diverse friends, even if my hometown at the time wasn't so diverse. In college, surrounded by diversity, which was fantastic. And then living internationally, naturally surrounded by diversity everywhere I go. So I think it was really starting to see, actually, I can try to work on writing and capturing diverse perspectives in as authentic ways as I can. Drawing from real lived experiences, elements of real people, other stories that I'm seeing or watching or reading about, and creating the characters that I can create in what feel a real and authentic way. Oftentimes, the characters I create, there is a link to someone who's real, right? Even if it's not a perfect match, it's never going to be a perfect copy and paste. And there are elements there that are real. And I've gotten questions in my own writing of, what are the sexualities of the characters? What are their orientations? Is Gwen trans? Is she not trans? What's the issue? And I think what I tried to do with this story was place it in a future where some of these classifications and categories were no longer as pertinent, right? Where some of the ways that we identify now, perhaps, thousands of years into the future when we've evolved, perhaps that's no longer our primary way of how we classify ourselves. It's really based on the abilities. But I was also trying to imagine, what would race be like in the future, and our characteristics, and what would we as humans look like, and how would we treat one another? And when the characters engage with one another, how do they describe each other? How do they view? So when Alejandro sees Yolamba or sees Kazuki or sees Landon, what is his way of describing? And I think another thing I see on social media, I saw someone posted on Instagram recently on Bookstagram, was that question of how we capture race in our writing, right? So oftentimes from the white perspective, we will capture the characteristics of brown or black characters and describe those in length. Some authors compare them to like plants, like mahogany, or unfortunately to food, yeah, like coffee or whatever. And I think there's some real tropes or real traps in terms of how we do that. And oftentimes white characters are not described. So it's almost as if they are the norm, right? So I think it's challenging that, right? It's not a white-centric focus on the work that we do, challenging ourselves in the writing to see, okay, how did I capture the diverse characters and from whose perspective, how are they describing them? And am I feeding into some of these traps that have, affected writers in the past? So I would say, yeah, just, I mean, try your best. And when you have the opportunity, also, if you're capturing characters from diverse perspectives, having beta readers from those backgrounds who can read into the authenticity of those characters, right? And give you critical feedback on the representation. It depends in the context and the time and place when you capture the characters. If it's a real world that relates with our existence now, or is it a futuristic or a completely fictional world or fantastical world? All of those things play into it. But I think it's kind of challenging ourselves along the way to not fall into some of the traps, but not to place so much pressure on ourselves where we feel like we can't write anything. We're almost paralyzed from doing something because we're afraid of offending someone.
Great question. Does anyone else have anything?
So there was like a lot of different abilities, and I was just wondering, like, were there any abilities or classifications that you thought of that like didn't make it into the final draft?
Yeah, so I suppose yeah, like I mean, you kind of have the top 6 abilities, which is strength, speed, flight, telepathy, telekinesis, invisibility. I think I thought about teleportation. And I did play around with the idea of time travel, but sometimes I see series like The Umbrella Academy or Heroes. When time travel is incorporated, things go really bonkers, right? So there were some things that I decided to actually steer away from, where I didn't have characters that actually would have that. If there was a character that could perform time travel, they would be classified as freely accelerated, and it would be quite a powerful ability, but it's not something I'm really entering into. I'm working on the second book. So even though Deficient is quite a standalone book, you get the beginning, middle, and end. It resolves, but there really is opportunity to continue telling the story. I'm exploring the classification of the feral ability much more, and there's so much scope there for that wild card ability. So I think that's been a lot of fun to do in the second book, to be able to play around with other abilities, some more powerful than others. And also in that time as well, introducing other characters and from other backgrounds. So it plays into the diversity question as well, in terms of being able to introduce new characters down the line who also contribute to the rainbow of diversity within the story. So I think I'm happy with the ones that are in the book, and it made it it made it possible to work in this world. It created a framework for constructing the world. And there's a scene, I think, in the beginning of the book, which is a dodgeball scene, right? So I wanted dodgeball to be like the worldwide sport that people were excited about. But when you have the students who are playing with their abilities against each other, it really, raises the bar, and it becomes quite a violent sport, right? But I also did that in a way where it was, if I had way too many abilities, it would be difficult to capture that scene. So I felt like I had just enough abilities to capture what was going on in the dodgeball scene. But then I think that also captures what happens in the day-to-day life in the world. So it felt like a manageable number of abilities, but also with the scope, with the feral ability to incorporate ones that maybe don't appear in the first book. I think another question. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, a question online. If you had one of the abilities you mentioned, which one would it be? Wait, sorry, the whole thing out here. What superpower would you want?
Great question. I always ask people this question, and then they ask me, and I'm like, I don't know. So my favorite. I'm sorry, like when I look up, I look like a cyborg. So sorry about that. I'll try to keep my head up. So growing up, my favorite superhero was always Storm from X-Men. And I remember like in the 90s being really disappointed going to the toy store because it was just like I'd go with my grandmother and I'd just see like, Wolverine, Cyclops, the Beast, the Juggernaut or whatever. And I just loved Storm. I thought she was so cool. She could control the weather. It was the most spectacular ability. Tornadoes, lightning, hail, sleet, blizzards, etc. She could fly on the wind. So I was like, if I could be anyone from the X-Men, it definitely would have been Storm. And I still remember the day, like the first day, it must have been 1995 or 1996, where I went into the store and actually saw the Storm character. And I think my grandmother just saw my face and she was like, oh my God, Michael really wants this. And she bought me the action figure. I don't think my father was so particularly happy that I was walking around with like a Storm action figure at home. But I just loved it. And I thought it was great for just to see that change over time in terms of what a hero could look like and that women could be really powerful superheroes. So for me, it was always Storm. And I thought she also reflected diversity in a really unique way. Her background is actually, she's even from Kenya, right? So I think one parent is from Kenya, one of her parents is a Black journalist from the United States. They met, and I think she grew up in Egypt. So I was always fascinated by her origin story and the incredible power. So if I could even have an ounce of what Storm has, I think I'd be really happy.
I had a question, and thank you for putting that question on the chat in Zoom, and anyone else who's on Zoom would like to do that, please go right ahead. And I've read the book, so I'm trying to figure out a way to ask this that it won't be a spoiler. But I thought we talked a little bit about Kazuki and why that's and as a favorite character, but I think that the particular power that Kazuki has makes for a real interesting writing challenge because of the way that perspective works. And I'm wondering whether that came naturally or was that something you really had to work on? And I'd also just would be willing to say, if you'd like to read a passage or with Kazuki, and that would also be great, but that's kind of on you if you have something you'd want to do for that.
Okay, yeah, I might have to flip through pages as I'm looking for a passage, but it's great as I think back to some of the key things I needed to rework on in the book. So Kazuki is classified as a legion. So he can turn invisible. So that's one of his abilities, but he can also read minds. So he's treated a little bit like an outsider because he has two abilities. He's also quite small in size and people don't really respect him. He struggles with his mind reading ability because he has trouble distinguishing people's thoughts from their actual words. And he doesn't really like making eye contact with people. So he gets confused. So he blurts out things, he's talking to you, but sometimes he's reading your mind and he's doing it by accident. And then he can also turn invisible. So he has kind of a nice set of abilities, but he's also extremely quirky and makes mistakes and gets muddled. And one of the characters actually tries to use Kazuki's abilities against Alejandro. And one of the endearing pieces about Kazuki is that he actually, even though he's underestimated, he still knows what's going on. And he finds creative ways to sort of defeat his rivals. And he's extremely intelligent, despite maybe projecting a bit of a quirky, not so aware of his surroundings vibe. And one of the scenes was really difficult to write was the story is told from Alejandro's perspective, right? But there's a really important scene that takes place more in the middle of the book where it has to go into Kazuki's perspective. And Kazuki kind of does something that really helps to advance the plot. So I had to think and think, how do I somehow switch the perspective to Kazuki's in the middle of the story, or avoid kind of telling the story from people reflecting on something that happened in a conversation, because that's also difficult for readers to follow. And then I introduced the piece of technology, right? So Kazuki's a real techie as well. And then through technology, Alejandro is able to track and trace Kazuki's movements and experience when he's invisible in a certain space. And that makes it actually feel live, that you're able to track and follow Kazuki, even though it's not his thoughts. Alejandro can see through Kazuki's perspective based on where he is and the technology that's being used. So I think that was another thing as well with a futuristic book, that you can actually toy around with technology in a futuristic setting to your advantage, to move along the plot, move along scenes. And it also forms part of Kazuki's personality and interests. So yeah, I hope that is clear. And as maybe if we're taking another question, I'll try to flip through and see if I can find something that's good for Kazuki.
I have another. One thing that touched me a lot while reading the novel was Alejandro's relationship with his family, especially with his mom. And I was just wondering if you could speak about that, if anything like parallels from your life.
Yeah, so great question. And my parents are actually on the call. I think there's like a little neighborhood watching support group happening. So thank you for joining. I've always had a really nice, close relationship with my mom. Happy belated birthday, Mom, as well. And I've always felt a lot of support throughout my life from my mother. So as well as from my father, right? But I grew up kind of in a difficult circumstance of, in the 90s, being queer in an environment where this was not really socially accepted. My father's background was he was a professional wrestler, right? So he wrestled for the WWE for many years, and is really this kind of, I think growing up was just this, almost like a superhero, like growing up with a father who felt like a superhero in a hyper masculinized field, right? We would go to the wrestling matches growing up. We were surrounded by the wrestlers. We'd meet them all. We'd meet Hulk Hogan, The Undertaker, Tatanka, the Ultimate Warrior. So it was a really interesting background, but I always felt somehow inferior because it was like a type of masculinity that I knew that I would never conform to or would never be really part of. And I think for that reason, always feeling a bit maybe frightened or feeling, I guess, deficient in the sense of not being able to live up to a standard that was expected of me or in society. The athletic mold, I think where I grew up also, athletics were a big thing, and I have like zero athletic talent in my body. So it was, I guess, that environment. But I think my mother sort of spotted the artistic talents that I had and was doing a lot to kind of support that growing up through art, through music. Both of my parents would attend, my marching band, competitions. So there was a lot of support there over time. And I think in understanding that, okay, Michael is different, and not forcing him to do things. I really was placing a lot of pressure on myself to force myself to do things that didn't naturally come natural to me, like different sports, football, baseball, basketball, just awful at all these things. And at least getting to the point where actually you do you, right? And I think that took a long time to get to, but I think there was that support behind the scenes around you do you. So I wanted Alejandro to have somewhat of a support system in his home. The characters of the father and the brothers are kind of like almost like Cinderella-like characters, right? Of the evil stepmother and the evil stepsisters, right? And I wanted to capture something that felt nuanced and felt real. And I think because I felt different and was different growing up, that was part of the conflicts that I came into with my own family members. And that fed into some of Alejandro's experience. But there was that sort of in the home system that he could go to. But at the same time, the mother's locked, right? She's locked into a relationship with a husband who turns against Alejandro once he's classified as a deficient, right? So his perspective and way of relating with Alejandro changes drastically the day that he finds out that he's actually classified as deficiently accelerated. And there's a good scene in the book where Alejandro comes to that revelation, right? And the mother, kind of cries, and he realizes that, this is who my son is, and she just doesn't want anything bad to happen to him. And I think even when I, came out to my parents, I remember my mother being very emotional and just saying, I don't want anything to happen to you in this world. It's a terrible world for anyone who's different. And I think that's also something similar that Alejandro experiences when his mother speaks with him the first time. And she just recognizes, you are who you are, and we have to accept that. But it's difficult because the brothers and the father do not. So the mother has to sort of maintain some sort of dynamic there within the household. She's a mind mover, which means she can move objects, or, with her mind. She's telekinetic, and she's trying to control things all the time. But these family members are actually beyond her control. Their bigotry, their hatred towards the deficiently accelerated is something that actually Alejandro's mother, as much as she loves Alejandro, she can't even get her own family members to see past those differences, which is really challenging for her. Great. I might take a passage because I think I flipped to a page where we have Kazuki. I'm happy to. I haven't read this passage before, so I'm happy to maybe read this in case that's helpful, and then take more questions. Yeah. So let's see where do I start here. Okay, so this is after another bullying incident, and kind of Kazuki helps save the day for Alejandro, and it's their first time meeting. And Kazuki's 1 year below Alejandro, so Alejandro's a third year in the fourth year system. Kazuki's a second year, and they're having a bit of a chat after this bullying incident. And they're both kind of like struggling with eye contact. It's something that they both actually have challenges with. I think Alejandro from a place of self-esteem, and maybe Kazuki, for being just who Kazuki is. So they're talking about, I think Kazuki says, maybe we should start with small increments. Today we look at each other for 5 seconds. Tomorrow we do 10. Sorry, I'm gonna take a sip of water. So Alejandro thinks, is he being serious? Does he want to keep associating with me? I mean, only if you want to, Kazuki says. So he's just read Alejandro's mind. Oh, no, it's not that. It's just, well, I thought I wouldn't want to hang out with you because you're a deficient. Kazuki stops himself once again. I mean, because you're deficiently accelerated. I guess I'm surprised. As you said, I don't have many friends. Neither do I. I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because you read people's minds incessantly. Sorry, I'm coughing a bit. I heard that, Kazuki says, proving my point exactly. It's who I am, Ale. I can't stop being my authentic self. Ale. It still sounds strange hearing someone besides Yolanda say my name. Ale, 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 Ale. What are you doing? I'm saying your name over and over. Ale, 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 Ale. Yeah, I noticed. But why? Kazuki shrugs. Because people don't say it enough. The little mind reader has a point. You know what? Kazuki asks. I'm glad Landon dragged me to the bathroom and forced me to read your thoughts. It was fun. I'm glad to be your source of entertainment. You know what I mean? You're not afraid to think certain things, even when you're around intimidating people. It's refreshing. My eyes shift to a small white pod vehicle hovering into the shuttle bus lot from the highway. It pulls up to where we're standing, and the tinted window slides down. I can see the pale and expressionless face of Kazuki's mother inside. Looks like Mama Tanaka is here, Kazuki says. His dark eyes scan me from head to toe. She won't be thrilled about the blood on your clothes, but I'm sure we can find a towel or something. Give me a second. You don't have to. Ignoring me, Kazuki scuttles to the vehicle. He and his mother stare at one another for an awkward amount of time. It's always strange seeing know-it-alls communicate with each other. Their arms and hands move, though their mouths don't budge, as their thoughts bounce back and forth between their minds. After a few seconds, Kazuki's mom peers over her single-lens sunglasses in my direction. Once she completes her inspection, she covers her eyes and acknowledges her son. When Kazuki lowers his head, I know he has lost. The tips of his boots drag along the walkway as he returns. I'm sorry, Ale. Maybe it's better if we try another time. My mom says she doesn't want to get the pod dirty. No worries. You go and I'll find my way home. I always do. Kazuki gives me a sad, almost longing look that seems to suggest there's something more behind the rejection. He weighs before folding himself into the passenger seat of the vehicle. Kazuki's head remains lowered as the vehicle's black window slides up. I watch the pod hover through the shuttle bus lot and zoom out of sight. Though I can't read minds like know-it-alls can, I think I know exactly what transpired between Kazuki and his mother during those moments of silent communication. I don't bother calling my parents this time. Instead, I walk. It takes me nearly 2 hours to get home by foot, but I don't mind. I have one good piece of news for anyone who's interested in learning how my day has gone. It doesn't matter that I fell into a puddle of rabbit's blood, or that I nearly got my head dunked into a toilet by Landon, or that Yolanda still doesn't want to talk to me. No, none of that seems to matter when I might have made my second friend ever. So I think that scene in the dialogue, it's maybe important to kind of go back and read and understand the communication between them. But it's that idea that Alejandro is trying to, they've just gone through this experience. Kazuki still wants to hang out. Alejandro is shocked by that. Kazuki's reading his mind, and Alejandro's not used to that either. And Kazuki really wants to offer, Ale support and offer him a ride home. But everyone knows that he's the deficient in the school. And parents, even parents and adults don't want their children associating with Alejandro. So as much as Kazuki can see past the discrimination and wants to be Alejandro's friend, I think because Kazuki's also experienced discrimination and has been felt different in his own life. But even then, he's not able to convince his own mother to even let Alejandro into the vehicle to bring him home after they've missed their shuttle bus. So that's a little bit of a scene that captures Kazuki's personality.
Thank you. That was a great scene to read. I think that really did work well. And I just also have to add, the fact that your dad has been a professional wrestler is a big detail to kind of just slip in at the end. That's material. You've got to work with that.
Yeah, and it's part of that, like literally growing up as someone who's just fantastical. And and I think my father, I guess he's on the call now too, but I think it's also a real testament to his own journey from where he came from the border region of, Mexico and Texas, growing up speaking Spanish, being the first person in his family to go to college, having this kind of extraordinary and strange career as a wrestler, and having an innate athletic ability that I think really enabled him and supported him to go to college, right? That was his ticket to success, and that was his superpower. So in a way, like my father was like an atlas in the story. So he was able to rely on that to be able to move forward and progress in his life and overcome some of the challenges and obstacles that he faced. And I think as a testament, someone who grew up from a really conservative background in Texas, very Catholic upbringing. We grew up, very kind of strict Catholic upbringing. Someone who's also been able over time to challenge his own beliefs, systems, and be very flexible and accepting and welcoming of people in all their diverse forms. So I think that's a real, for me, that's been a really interesting thing to see from his journey and to learn about a character and how real characters change over time. And I think that also influences the characters that we create, right? That it's easy to create kind of two-dimensional characters that, feel more like almost like cartoon characters, right? But characters are changing, right? And there's a growth journey behind everyone. So I think it's also being aware of the growth journey of the characters in our own lives and ourselves as well. And some characters change for the better. Some characters, change for the worse in terms of villains. And I think that's also interesting in terms of understanding the depths of why the villainous characters change the way that they change and what justifies their actions and behaviors. And I love the morally gray piece of villains as well, that we all have good and we all have bad. And at certain points in time, it might be activated, certain elements of it might be activated more than others. But one of the things I love about writing is capturing that from the villainous perspective and tapping into that moral grayness.
All right, great. Well, I think that kind of brings us to a close. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone in the room, thank you for joining us. I mean, this was really great to listen to you talk about your book and your life and everything that's kind of influenced that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. Sorry, I've been coughing a little bit. I did get a cold this week, but this has been a fantastic opportunity. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for reading the book and sharing your really thoughtful reflections and questions. I'd be happy to hear if you weren't able to share a question or your thoughts with the book. Please feel free to write. I have a website and there's a comment section, and I'm happy to engage over email and follow up with anyone who's interested. If you do read the book, please feel free to review it as well on, whether you use Goodreads or Amazon or wherever you like to review books. It's really helpful for a first-time author. And thanks to, Jim and everyone for making this opportunity and for showing your interest in the book. It really means a lot.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming, and those of you on Zoom, thank you for Zooming. All right. Oh, wait, we have to figure out who won the raffle. That's right. I thought we were done.
Oh, yeah.
She get in that.
Well, I put you guys in the, if you, is there anyone else who wants to be in it that I haven't put in?
Didn't get in.
No. Okay, this is my most nerve-wracking moment of my life.
Nerve.
We believe in you.
Tell me when to stop.
All right, that's good.
Joseph.
All right, we'll talk, but I'll be able to go get you the book then, all right?
Congratulations.
All right, Mike,
All
we
right.
should let you get to sleep.
All right, take care, everyone. Stay warm. I know it's cold these days, but thank you again for your time. And we'll be back.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.